I think that's about it for housekeeping. I'd like to now throw over to AAI's CEO Joy Lewis, just to give a bit of background about the company for those who aren't familiar and why we're involved in the Kickstart scheme. Joy?
Thank you, Nick. Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm CEO and founder at Adopt an Intern. Now, that's our official name, but we now trade under AAI EmployAbility, or AAI for short. And this new name takes into account all the things we do under one umbrella of inclusive employment specialists. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about what that actually means in order to explain the three main reasons we are acting as a gateway organization for the Kickstart scheme. So we're a social enterprise, first and foremost. Our main aim, or our main service, is the placement of job seekers into paid work. Businesses come to us because we're different from recruitment agencies. We're not on commission, we're affordable, and we advertise everything widely. And by advertising widely, we're ensuring that everyone, no matter their background or economic status, has equal access to every job we post. And because of that, we attract a lot of diversity, which is becoming ever more important for business growth, especially right now. And I should add here that this experience with diversity and marginalized groups has seen us add other strings to our bow, such as workshops on diversity, race, unconscious bias, disability and mental health. So we've placed over 1,600 job seekers into paid work with over 1,000 employers. And AAI itself has employed 22 young interns over the years. And although we specialize in young graduates, we don't ourselves have an age limit because we attract a lot of underemployed talent as well, such as returners, like people who've taken time out to have a child. So, number one, although the Department of Work and Pensions, DWP, will be doing the actual matching of candidates for the Kickstart programme, we understand young people and how to support businesses on that journey and the obstacles that may arise. And number two, we have always worked with government and government bodies. For 7 years, we applied for and were lucky enough to receive grants that enabled us to place funded interns into businesses and charities, businesses that would not have been able to pay the wages of an intern. So we were the intermediary. The wages, for example, were paid through us in a similar way to the Kickstart programme. And finally, supporting young people to gain employment has meant we have a lot of experience of employability training, something the government is asking you to either undertake or outsource with this scheme. And we'll cover all your questions on this right now. So let me hand you back. I'm going to hand you to Renee now. So Renee is our lead on the Kickstart scheme, and she's working closely with our colleague Mandy, who is behind the scenes today monitoring Slido for us. Now, there isn't much Renee doesn't know about Kickstart. And in fact, after a DWP webinar that we were on yesterday, Renee and I were actually advising then. So without further ado, Renee.
Thank you, Joy. Good morning and welcome to all of you. My name is Renee Philippi, and as Joy mentioned, I am the AAI Kickstart project lead, which means basically I have been eating, breathing, and sleeping Kickstart for the past couple of months. Matter of fact, I think my computer browser has made the government's website my favorite bookmark on its own. But in addition to the research and talking with the different DWP contacts that we've been able to identify, to date, AAI has submitted applications on behalf of 55 different employers for 240 placements. And simply going through those processes has taught us a lot. So Nick, I think I'm prepped to answer the questions you're going to present today.
Beautiful. So yes, we've been taking employers' questions, and there's quite a lot of similar themes coming up. I've just dropped the link to the Slido there. Do you have any comments, though, coming in on the Zoom chat that are not questions? If you want to send something privately to one of the team, neither Renee or I will be able to view these or answer them during today's session. But if you've got anything you want to send, you can send that to Joy privately, but do please try and use the Slido, and we'll do our best to add any late submitted questions. So we're going to cover a lot of ground this morning. There's been a lot of questions coming in over the last couple of weeks, so I think we'll just get cracking. Renee, I'd like to start with the Kickstart application process. Do you have to have 30 jobs? Someone says, I know some other businesses who want to just have 2 or 3 roles. Could we partner up for an application?
Absolutely. That is the role of the intermediaries, or as we are now known as, the gateways. When the program was initially announced, the focus was trying to get as many placements as possible. And I think the initial parameters were you had to have 30. But I think the government soon realized that there are quite a few businesses who don't even have that many on their staff. And they have therefore created this gateway scheme, if you will, in that what we do is represent employers who have anywhere up to, well, we can actually represent employers that have more than 30 as well. But those of you who are only looking for 1 or 2 or 5 or 6 placements, we collate all your information. And when we have a cohort of at least 30, we submit the application on your behalf to the government.
Beautiful. And another big question that's come in is, what type of companies can be eligible for the scheme? Are there any restrictions on size or industry?
No, that's one of the great things about the program. Absolutely no restrictions or limitations. We've had some interesting queries from people looking to place interesting types of placements, shall we say. One of the things that's nice is that even sole traders can apply for the program, although the government is still determining how they will qualify sole traders. But in the meantime, if you are a sole trader, feel free to submit your placement.
Lovely. So what does the application process actually look like for employers? How long does it take, and what is their commitment?
I'll take that in 2 parts. The application process from the standpoint of AAI, if you have fewer than 30 placements, you will need to use a gateway. So if you are working with us and you simply send us an email, or you've gotten onto our website and you've registered your interest, that's the first step. What we do at that point is ask you to formally register your interest through the link on our website so we can look at the preliminary qualifying information. If we have any questions or concerns based on what the government is requiring, we'll get in touch. And if not, you'll receive a second link, or a link to a second form, in which we get the specifics of the placements that you are looking for. And then we handle things on our end from there. From the government standpoint, when an application is submitted, for example, by us, they review all of the placements by a panel, and that's as much information as we have on that. But the panel is giving themselves a month to what we've heard now is 6 weeks to review any requests for placements. They then provide preliminary approval on the placement to us. And it's at that point that a detailed job description is requested. I'll get into more of the specifics of that process at that point, but the preliminary time frame after submission of application is at least 4 to 6 weeks for initial review.
Okay, so realistically, is that when a Kickstart job could start then? How soon after applying could a job role start?
Well, after the placement is initially approved, as I mentioned, it's then that they request the detailed job description. Right now, that process has not totally been clarified, whether it's still going to be a more centralized government body requesting it, or if at that point the placement request gets handed over to the local job centers and the individual work coaches then start engaging either with the employer or with the gateway. But that is when the detailed job description is presented. Once it's in the hands of the work coaches, they start identifying potential candidates. The goal of the work coaches is to present 5 to 7 candidates for each placement. And then it's between the work coach and the employer as to how that interview process will occur. And it's the employer's choice. So if it takes a week or 2 for job coaches to identify 5 to 7 candidates, and then the interview process is another week or 2, we're looking at easily another 3 to 4 weeks on top of the original approval. So right now, our sense is that placements, if they were submitted today, could potentially not actually start for anywhere from 2 to 3 months.
Okay. For the people who are just joining now, we're just covering the application process for Kickstart and what it looks like, what your commitment is, and how it works with a gateway intermediary organisation. Final question, Renee, for now, on the application process. From an employer's point of view, what do they need to prepare in terms of any documents throughout the duration of the application or the scheme, any kind of monthly reports?
Right now, there has been nothing like that identified by the government. That is still, I truly believe, work in progress from their standpoint. As with many of these types of schemes, the broad overview of the scheme was announced, but the actual infrastructure needed to implement each step of the process is being created kind of off the cuff or as we go along. So those types of things have not been identified to date.
Okay, so let's move on to the money, the funding and the wages. I'll group two questions together because I think your answer might cover them both. So how soon will the grant money be issued to a business? Is there any initial cost to the business? And then how do wage payments work thereafter for the employer?
One of the questions that we received in addition to that is there a charge to you as an employer to us as a gateway? And I'll tell you right now, no. Any compensation that we receive is from the government. The first set of money, if you will, or funding of money that is issued by the government is what you may be familiar with as what they're referring to as the setup cost funding. That's a £1,500 fund for each placement. That is issued to your gateway organization, to us, on your behalf, only when the placement begins. So when the placement starts, the £1,500 is issued, and we then transfer it to you to get that individual set up in the job and potentially to provide the training they need, which we'll get into, I think, a little bit later, Nick. In terms of wages, originally the government had only planned to pay wages in arrears at 4 months and 7 months. But I think they quickly realized that was quite prohibitive for most companies given the current economic climate. So they have been modifying that, and the current plan is that they will be paying wages in arrears at each month. They will be using HMRC records to verify that the employee has been paid and that they are enrolled in your payroll and are a part of the AAI scheme. So that has to be done. But once they have verified that, at the end of at the end of each month of the placement, they will transfer funds to your gateway, who then transfers them on to you.
Okay, and as Joy mentioned at the start of the webinar, this is a process that AAI handled for just about over 7 years, managing government funding for wages with companies. So even though that does sound complicated, it's something we've got a lot of experience in. In terms of the wages, the Kickstart scheme wages are going to be for the national minimum wage. And one of the questions we've had come in is, what happens if your company is a living wage employer and pays more than the minimum wage? Does the company or the government pay the difference in that situation?
Yes, as you said, Nick, the funding is for minimum wage, and it is also for a maximum of 25 hours a week. So some companies pay living wage, and some companies pay more than that, dependent on band of the role that they have. And other companies really want somebody in full time, more than 25 hours. Anything in excess of 25 hours at minimum wage will need to be fully funded by your company.
Okay, so that leads us on nicely to the audience, the job seekers. Can you tell us a little bit more about the candidate audience of the scheme and what level of skill employers can expect?
Yes, the scheme is very much directed to getting 16 to 24-year-olds who are currently on universal credit into work. That is the pool of candidates. And in terms of the skill level, what may have historically been perceived to be the skill level of that group of candidates has radically changed in the last 8 to 10 months. We're getting queries, because AAI also works with job seekers, queries from university graduates who just can't find anything out there, and they're currently on universal credit. They are perfect candidates, and they are a part of this pool. So 16 to 24-year-olds currently on universal credit, but there are many reasons why they are there.
Yeah, and this is a big topic for us actually. When this was announced, we quickly realized there'd be a lot of very talented people in our audience who might not be aware of this, because a lot of big companies have put hiring freezes on this year and lots of graduate schemes have been cancelled. There are a lot of people out there who might not know to be signed up for universal credit. So we've done a fair bit of work going out to that job seeker audience to get them to enroll for that so that they're eligible for this tidal wave of jobs which are going to be coming. There's a lot of questions about different types of candidates, but it's fair to say that along with every type of job role which can be eligible, that will also mean that there's going to be a huge pool of diverse talents and skill sets within that. And I suppose that's going to be something which is managed by the job centre job coaches, is that right?
Yes, and can I just say, I mean, if you're considering applying for a placement, just bear your own requirements in mind. If you're looking for somebody with 10 years of experience, they're not going to be in this pool. They're going to be 16 to 24 years old. If you're looking for somebody who has a certain university qualification, that's quite feasible. But again, those types of details in the job description will be worked through between the work coach and the employer.
Yes, and that leads us on nicely to who is responsible for sourcing the candidates. So people are asking, how does that promotional process work?
It's all handled by the job centers, by the work coaches at the job centers. So they have, I would guess, the largest pool of candidates right now they've probably ever been trying to place into jobs. And the job descriptions go to the work coaches and they go through their pool of candidates. So they are the ones that are doing the sourcing, if you will. They are the ones doing the matching.
People are asking what the employer's ability is to promote the job. Is that something which hasn't quite been ironed out yet?
There are a couple of ways that an employer can promote a job. Directly advertising it is not something that is being recommended or at all endorsed right now. And the reason for that, again, is because the job seekers need to already be signed up to universal credit and be working with a work coach at the job center. So if a company starts trying to advertise something, they will undoubtedly get potential candidates coming directly to them. It's not the way the system is set up to work. What we are advising employers, however, because we have had a few come to us and say, I've got a great candidate. This person just got out of uni. They've got the qualifications I need. They are on universal credit. How can I get them in? What we recommend, and it was actually endorsed yesterday on the call that Joy mentioned we were on by people representing the DWP job centers, is that you stay in touch with that candidate. Again, make sure they are on universal credit and are already working with a work coach. And when your placement has been approved, let the candidate know. The candidate can then go to their work coach and advise them of the fact that they want to be put forward for that role. That does not mean that they will necessarily get it in terms of being the only candidate put forward, because this is the work coaches are absolutely trying to ensure there is no discrimination here. They will present you with 5 to 7 candidates for the role. But again, it's you as the employer who ultimately determines who takes the role. So it's slightly, I won't say behind the scenes, it's just not a direct, don't try to advertise for these roles. But if you are identifying candidates that you think are really a good potential match, make sure they are advising their work coaches that they would like to have be put forward for your role.
Indeed, and this is where this scheme is markedly different from how AAI works in terms of promotion, but the work coaches are in essence taking on that independent conduit role, and then it's over to the employers to interview and appoint. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So someone's asking, given the current pandemic situation, can candidates work remotely and then check in regularly via Zoom? What are the limitations around where people are when they do these roles?
We got direct confirmation on that directly from DWP, because again, we had a few employers who were asking that question, and it's totally dependent on what the role is comprised of. So if it is a position where they need to report to an office or to a workplace or a factory, then that's what needs to happen. But given that the government itself continues to encourage us to work from home wherever possible, 100% remote conditions are absolutely acceptable. The one thing is that you have to, of course, ensure that the candidate has whatever is required to successfully perform the job. So if that is equipment, if that is extra instruction, if they've never worked remotely before, if it's extra communication, it's all dependent on the parameters of the role and what is considered necessary for them to successfully do the job.
Excellent.
Can I come in there, Nick? Sorry. We've had another question in on the chat about that, and it's a good question. It says, is there any advice being organised for candidates for the prospect of these young people starting a role remotely? So, you know, are DWP thinking who's going to be helping them with this new task of working remotely?
Well, that one would tie into what I believe to be the training that each candidate receives. And again, as the employer, you'll need to be aware of that. If this is a person who has never worked remotely, there's a whole different flavor of teamwork and communication that goes along with remote working. And that would need to be something that is a part of the training that you as the employer would provide that candidate. So when we get into more of the training topics, we can probably address that a little bit more.
Indeed, yeah. And the work coaches will be floating around in the background, so to speak, as that almost independent confidant to answer any questions that the candidates have. So they're with a very light touch, I believe they're going to be offering some level of support to candidates. But certainly as an employer at this point in the year, hopefully you do have some kind of remote working framework and processes set up. I understand if you're looking to hire your first person this year through that, then that might be a concern, but there's a lot of advice out there for that kind of process.
And actually, Nick, just one little point on that. One of the things that came out in the call we were on yesterday, again, because this is work in progress in terms of the whole infrastructure being created on the go, what was mentioned yesterday is that there's a potential that some of the job centers may be either taking on new or identifying specific work coaches simply to work with Kickstart placements. And our sense is that as these types of issues become more apparent, such as the additional support required to work remotely and how the candidates actually settle into the role, the work coaches will have to provide perhaps different assistance than they have before. So the hope is that DWP will continue making sure those resources are available to assist the candidates.
That's good, yes. And it is worth mentioning that these details are rolling out quickly, and we have regular correspondence with DWP to ensure that we're giving people who work with us the most up-to-date information. One of the parameters of the Kickstart scheme is this 25 hours per week. Someone's asking, is this a minimum requirement or a maximum requirement?
Both. It's a minimum requirement in terms of hours, and it's maximum in terms of what the government will reimburse you. So they must work at least 25 hours a week. But as I mentioned before, if you'd like them to work more, then you will have to pay the difference.
Okay, so in terms of the candidates, someone's asking, what is the procedure in the case of a conflict or issues with a candidate not fulfilling their duties? Will the employer be provided with any support? What is the situation with that process?
I believe they're trying to handle it as they always have with job center placements, which is, yes, if a person isn't working out, then that needs to be communicated to the work coach, and means of addressing the issues will be considered. But ultimately, if it really isn't a fit, then they will replace that individual with someone else. So it's not a matter of you get one shot. Once you've interviewed, you pick the best candidate and they start with you, you're stuck with them for 6 months. That is not the case.
And on the other side of that coin, what happens if and when the role is a huge success and the 6-month funded Kickstart placement comes to an end? How easy is it to transition that person to a permanent employee?
I think the government is going to try to make this as absolutely seamless as possible. Their goal is to get people into work and keep them in work. So there are no restrictions, limitations, as long as you're set up to actually continue keeping them on your payroll and paying them. I can't anticipate there being a single hitch in that process.
Yeah, you know, it is very much, if managed correctly, it's a try before you buy. 6 months will absolutely fly by. A lot of people are asking about this mandatory training. Someone said, I've heard that some of the grant money has to be spent on training. What does this include and what are the costs?
This is going to be completely individual to each company and each placement. So at the end of the 6-month placement, the person who has worked for you has to have what is being termed as employability skills. They have to leave with more than they came with. And the government gives a number of examples of what that consists of. So there is obviously on-the-job skill training. If you're bringing somebody on board to do something they've never done before, you have to provide them with the training to do that role. But there's also what is referred to as wraparound employability support. If you are bringing on a placement just for the 6 months and they will be leaving after that for whatever reason, they really need support to try to find work. And if some of these candidates have not necessarily gone through the process or have not had assistance in creating a proper CV, in knowing how to present their skills, interview preparation, sending out cover letters, those basic things that are essential to looking for a job. And that is also something the government really wants these people who don't already have that skill set to have when they leave these placements. But it's, again, really dependent on what you can offer and how you can offer it. So some companies that we're already working with have indicated that that is just part of their basic induction process, their basic training protocol. And if somebody's going to leave the company, they will absolutely provide that wraparound employability support. If that's the case, then there's no money that has to be spent on that. If, however, you aren't able to provide that training, or maybe only a portion of it, and want to outsource to get some of the other training provided, that is the purpose of that £1,500. So the £1,500 is not being dictated as to how it is spent, but it is to be spent on setup. And that can include the training, that can include uniforms, that could include equipment, whatever it takes to get that person properly set up and to leave your place of employment with employability skills. And in terms of how that £1,500 is going to be monitored or how it is spent has to be reported, that is still work in progress as well.
Absolutely, and it's worth mentioning that we have already designed some wraparound training around soft skills, identifying transferable skills and employability to accompany these placements as well, and that will be discussed on a case-by-case basis. As you mentioned, Renee, there'll be on-the-job stuff, but there is also this required training, and we'll be consulting on employers about that down the line, won't we?
Yes, actually, we have put a little bit more information about that on our website page. If you would like to get more specific information on the type of training that AAI can help you with, please revisit, if you did this a couple of weeks ago, revisit our website, go to our Kickstart page, and there will be a link there that will take you to an overview of the training. It's a pretty good overview in terms of breaking down the types of services we can provide, and it will give you a flavor for what you might immediately recognize as something that you could use and other things that you can actually do in-house. So again, those services, whatever you decide, if you'd like to engage with us to provide them, will be set up in advance, will only be, the cost for them will be also determined in advance, and all of that only actually implements or gets affected once the placement starts work. The £1,500, a portion of that can be used for us to do some of the training. And if you can already do it in-house, that's great. Then you can use the 1,500 pounds as you need to.
Okay, so we've managed to get through all the initial questions we had before the webinar went live, but I can see that both the chat and the Slido have been going quite wild. So we'll try and get through some additional questions here. Some of them might have been addressed in the chat. So Joy, just help me out with this as we go. Are you ready for quick fire, Renee?
On you go.
Okay, so application. Can the application be fast tracked, as waiting for up to 1 month is a long time?
Ha, that would be the goose that lays the golden egg if we had a way to do that. We have been knocking on every available door possible to even try to get status updates on applications we have already submitted. And all we have to use right now is a centralized email address that services the whole of the UK. So unfortunately, I do not see that. It certainly isn't an option at this point. We can't even get complete up to the moment status on existing applications, let alone ask them to be fast tracked. It would be lovely if that occurs in the future, and we will certainly advise you if it does.
Okay, and that actually is maybe a good point to talk about. You know, we mentioned the skills earlier. Somebody was asking about software engineers. If you have an urgent need, then perhaps this process is not for you. So suppose the question would be, who is this scheme not for at the time, Renee?
Yeah, definitely urgent need. The government's official line on this is they are hoping to have the first placements start in November. The first application that we submitted was done in September, at the beginning of September. And other than getting one email from the centralized email address asking us to reconfirm the number of placements, we have gotten no update on it whatsoever. So bear in mind, again, we haven't gotten the placements approved, which means there's been no job description, detailed job description information requested. The work coaches don't even have visibility of it yet. So the application we submitted at the beginning of October may well not actually begin until after the first of the year. We're kind of guessing on that right now, but we're not trying to raise any false hopes here. So if you have an immediate need, don't count on this one to fill that. I know I had a couple of employers saying, oh, we really need some help before Christmas because we're really trying to get, sorry, I can't even advocate that right now. It's something you should count on. So from that standpoint, yes, I don't think the Kickstart scheme would be a great fit for you. And also, again, if you're looking for highly qualified individuals with years of experience, that's not going to be this pool of candidates.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning there as well, if you create a job with an urgent need, you then can't advertise that job as a Kickstart job later on, is that right?
The Kickstart, and that's a really good point, Nick, the Kickstart scheme will only be applied toward new roles. So they are trying to ensure that redundancies aren't being made and then those roles are being refilled by free labor, if you will. They're trying to ensure that things aren't being manipulated to where, oh, this role is kind of different and we're just going to massage it around. And it's also if a role, and this was very definitely, it was a question that was presented in the call we were on yesterday. If your company has already been advertising or trying to recruit for a role, it does not fall into the Kickstart scheme. These have to be brand new roles that do not exist. And I suppose one other mention of that in terms of the redundancy factor, it's if the roles that people have been made redundant in the past 6 months. So the government, again, is kind of going back to March when we went into the lockdown and everything fell apart. And if you had made redundancies, say in January, because business was slow last year, that could be a different picture. But that's exactly what they're trying to avoid is those types of scenarios.
Yeah, it's about displacement of people who were already in the employment pipeline with your company, isn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of money, someone's just asked a quick question about the grant. Can we use the setup grant to purchase a laptop for the employee? If that is required to do the role, if we don't employ that person, do we have to give that laptop back? So would the government own that product?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect example of how the setup costs could ideally be used, but it's very much, it's a company, this is nothing you're purchasing for the employee. Now, it might be different with uniforms. Perhaps that's your standard process. Once you purchase uniforms for an individual, they do keep them. You don't want them back. But any type of equipment, anything that is actually a company's property is absolutely yours to keep.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be property of the government as well. It belongs to the company once the grant money is issued.
Correct.
Guys, can I step in again with another question here? This
Yep.
is relevant to the previous question, I think. I think it's Anne is asking whether the contract of employment is drawn up between the placement and the employer. She's concerned about the obligation for holidays and sickness, etc.
The contract for the placement in terms of the Kickstart funding is between the government and the gateway company. But the contract for employment is very definitely between the employer and the employee. And the reimbursement of wages includes those types of benefits. So the insurance contributions that have to be made to maintain an employee and any other pension contribution schemes and those types of things that are legally required, those will also be paid in addition to the minimum wage that is paid to the employee by the government for the 6 months. But the contract is between the employer and the employee.
That answers your question, Anne. And we have another one as well, and this is probably for Nick to answer here. Will the unanswered questions on Slido be answered later and shared?
That's an interesting question. Certainly we're recording this and we're going to make it available on request. We're going to try and do our best to get through them. I've got about 12 more questions here. If you want to email us your question, we'll be sending around a wrap-up email which you can reply to for more specific stuff. But certainly we're trying to cover as much ground as we can here because we're getting a lot of the similar questions from employers throughout this process. So yes, we will try. We will do it via email after the wrap-up email goes out.
Okay. Let's get through those last 12 questions.
Indeed. So someone's asking about job seekers. They say, Joy, you mentioned work returners. Will they qualify for this too?
Yeah, I actually answered that on Slido, and the answer is simple. You know, these young people are aged between 16 and 24. The likelihood of finding a returner in that age is not high. So it's restricted by the age, only the age.
Yeah, someone's asking as well if we know why the age has been set at 24. Renee, has there been any discussion around that?
No, I actually don't know why 24 was chosen. I would assume it's because the government has looked at has done some sort of study on who is most impacted by unemployment right now in the current climate, and that appears to be the group that is.
Someone's asked, how long does the young person have to have been unemployed before they're eligible for Kickstart? And they're specifically relating to students who might be graduating in 2021.
That is actually a really good question, and I have not seen anything about any type of time requirement on that. They just must currently be on universal credit and signed up with the job center. And because the scheme does run through the end of next year, and that's undoubtedly why the scheme has been set up to run through the end of next year, is the government is probably trying to do some advanced planning on how to support next year's graduates.
Yeah, and this is something we sent out to our job seekers who are students. When they changed job seekers allowance to this larger umbrella banner of universal credit, there is something in there for people who are currently students to access some kind of job seekers allowance and allow them to be in that system. So if there are students out there who want to be part of this in the future, they can get in touch with a job coach now and they'll explain the legalities of them being in that pipeline later on. Someone's asking again, what happens if you don't like the candidates that are shortlisted by the coaches?
That's between you and the work coach, and you go back to them and say, sorry, none of these are suitable, and you have to give them specific indications as to why, obviously. But right now, they are not trying to say, this is all you get, pick from this. They're going to work with you as much as possible because it needs to be the right fit, or if it's not going to work out for either you or the candidate.
Yep, and certainly something that we do at AAI when we're consulting employers on their job spec is to make it as inclusive as possible, to make it realistic. And, you know, unfortunately that process is out of our hands, but the job coaches will be working with the employers to ensure that they've got a realistic job spec that goes out to this audience, because nobody knows that job seeker audience better than their own work coaches at that point.
Nick, can I add something to that, please? We also know that if it doesn't work out, you will not have the money removed. You will keep your 1,500. And what they will try and do is replace a person who isn't working out for you. You can also, I think this is relevant too, that if you like that person, you can't, and you don't keep them on, you're not going to keep them on, but you want that job to keep going, you can go back and ask for another person. Sorry, you may have covered this earlier, I didn't hear. You can ask for another person. Yeah,
that's a great point. Someone's got a great question about remote working, and they've said, in terms of locality, is it the case that your job has to be promoted to local job centres to recruit, or would the pool of applicants potentially be UK-wide?
That is something we've been trying to get a bit more detail on, because we've had that question presented before. In the call we were on yesterday, the work coaches are absolutely working with geographical location. And that is undoubtedly because historically, travel to work is a consideration and a factor. Our understanding is that when people are signed up with the job center, candidates, job seekers, they can actually go in and look at jobs UK-wide. So right now, from the information we've been able to gather, that's going to be the best way of job seekers seeing available roles outside of their immediate region. I think right now, quite honestly, the work coaches are probably going to be so inundated with trying to match candidates, they are going to have to be limited to their geographical range. And now here I'm conjecturing, but if the nature of the role is completely remote and depending on the requirements of it, you know, our hope is that they will start broadening their scope in finding candidates. And that would seem to mean that they would have to go beyond a geographical range, but this is conjecture and hope, because it could be very simple to match a qualified candidate from Scotland with a role in England and vice versa. So hopefully that will be the case, but right now it doesn't seem like there are very firm processes in place to ensure that happens.
Yep, and I suppose that also ties in with what they decide on the employer's ability to promote the job themselves. So on that, it will just be a discussion once your application is approved. Someone's asking about AAI and if we only work in Scotland. So Renee, maybe you could tell us about some of the, you know, we've been managing inquiries for employees across the UK, and maybe Joy, you could follow that up with a little bit about how AAI works in general.
Yes, if you look even at the government's website at the approved list of gateways, there are quite a few of them, and we are right there at the top of the list because our name starts with A, of companies that can support throughout the UK. We can absolutely, we're not limited by region at all. We are not limited to Scotland. And we have had placements, we have submitted placements, I would say in just about every region of the UK. I just can't remember if we've done one for Wales yet. But there's absolutely nothing limiting us, and we provide the same support no matter where you are in the UK.
Excellent. Joy, could you remind people about how AAI works in general across the UK?
Yeah, so we work with employers across the UK who are looking to work with somebody that's not a recruitment agency. They want to attract a diverse audience, and they may be not getting that from either the recruitment agency they're using or their own methods. You know, lots of people just go on LinkedIn, but they're getting the same kind of people, which isn't adding diversity into their workforce. So that's why we have connected across the country. We're used to working with employers across the country. And as you know, we have young people at our hearts. Yes.
So this is an interesting one, and I don't know if this is maybe for you, Joy. Someone's asked, how does the Kickstart scheme align or complement the Scottish Youth Guarantee initiative / programme?
Well, I think that the government, when they organised Kickstart and set it up, they thought about all the other schemes that were out there. And so they are talking to all those other schemes as well. So if you're concerned about that, I would go back to that organization or scheme and check in with them how they're working with Kickstart. But I'm pretty sure that DWP are aware of all the other integrated organizations and schemes.
There's a question here about, do the work placements need to be auto-enrolled in an employer's pension scheme?
Yes. If that is what how you are set up, and that is a legal requirement, yes, they do. And again, the government will pay the employer's contribution to that.
Someone says, at what stage do you need to qualify for this funding, which I believe ends in January? Do you actually have to have recruited by the end of January?
No, January is not any kind of deadline that I'm aware of. The scheme runs through the end of next year. What that means is you can request placements that start up until the 31st of December 2021. So they will actually run into 2022. If you are in a position right now, actually, I'm glad this question came up, because what I'm suggesting to people, those who think, oh, we might have a need for one or two toward the end of the year, get your requests in now. We've already gone through the timing it's taking for applications to be reviewed and approved. Get them in now. However, don't just say, oh, I might need somebody next July, depending on how I do over the next 4 months. Don't do that either, because then resources will potentially be allocated to reviewing information that isn't actually going to come to fruition. So really get a good sense of where your business is at, but don't wait until you want somebody to start the following week. Take it in consideration what the process is, and you can absolutely apply for roles to be filled up until the end of next year. I wouldn't recommend you wait until December of next year to get somebody started that month, again, because of the review process, but just take those timeframes into consideration.
Yep, and certainly the sooner you register interest with a gateway organization, the sooner you can start feeling more comfortable about when this is going to work out for you. Someone's asked, given the maximum funding of 25 hours per week, is it expected that these roles will be advertised as part-time?
Our understanding right now is that they are going to be very, I say, Kickstart specific. And they are going to be trying to match candidates full stop. So I really do not think they're going to be advertised as part-time roles. That would not benefit as many people as possible. I actually think the reason they've set the 25-hour time frame is to allow people who do need some flexibility in their schedules to perhaps participate, and obviously to minimize costs to some degree. But I think what they're trying to do is accommodate as many individuals as possible. If they said these have to all be full-time roles, you are potentially going to eliminate some candidates for being eligible.
Yeah, and I suppose it's up to the employer if they want to advertise a role at full-time and top up the wages as well.
Yes.
Okay, final question for this session. It goes back to something we mentioned earlier about the setup funds and the stuff you can use that for. Someone's asked, working remotely, do candidates have to have their own IT equipment, or does the company have an obligation to provide this?
There hasn't been anything that I've seen that states that at all. And this is going to be, I believe, part of the conversation that will occur with the work coach. From our experience, if you are expecting candidates to have their own equipment, you are going to limit your candidate pool. Again, if you think about the age range of candidates that are in consideration here, and that is why the government is giving you the 1,500 pounds. So all the way around, it's going to make more sense and be a lot easier if you just provide the equipment that they need. You're going to have a larger pool of candidates from which to work, and you've been given the funding to do that. And in terms of would your placement not be approved, or would they not try to fill the role if your requirement is that the candidate have their own computer equipment? Again, that hasn't been stipulated, and that will probably be a conversation that has to be had with the work coach when it gets to that point.
Excellent. Okay, so that's all we have time for now. We tried to get through as much as we could in an hour. In the chat there, I've just dropped a link to our Kickstart page where you can read a little bit more about the scheme and register interest. That's also where we've got a link to the wraparound training information. We are going to be sending a wrap-up email out to everyone explaining a little bit more about how they can get the ball rolling with this. Hopefully we've been able to demystify some of the ins and outs of the process of the Kickstart scheme. As Renee mentioned, information about this is moving quickly. We've got our ear to the ground and we're being able to advise employers of all sizes, all sectors, about how they can benefit from this scheme and what they need to be doing now to be eligible. If you want more information about what AAI does in general, our approach to inclusive recruitment and employment support, the diversity and inclusion training that Joy mentioned, there's going to be a link in that email about general information for employers looking to do things just that little bit better when it comes to employment. With that being said, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Special thank you to Renee for being the fountain of knowledge on all things Kickstart. Thank you so much, Joy, for being able to support with a lot of the backup information about the processes of AAI. And we are going to be doing another webinar about Kickstart in the coming weeks or months, depending on what information is coming out. But certainly those people who come on board with us as a gateway organization will be the first to know about how their applications are actually processed. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you all next time.